Today is a very special day as this week's episode of Bleach is the 400th anime episode of the series, and what a way to celebrate them by having Kubo's favorite character, Mayuri, finally get his big fight against Pernida, which is being adapted into the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime. Episode 34 was perfectly paced as it adapted the first half of Mayuri's battle against Pernida, adapting manga material from the midpoint of chapter 635 to the very first page of chapter 640. While staying faithful to the manga, it does mean that this episode featured the least amount of anime original content that we have seen so far within Cour 3. I do believe that this was a smart move by the anime staff because everything is so faithfully adapted, like Kenpachi and Mayuri's banter reacting to the strange Pernida, Kenpachi losing his arm and then having to be paralyzed by Mayuri, and then you have the amazing reveal of Pernida as the left arm of the Soul King, and not to forget the long-awaited reveal of Mayuri's modified Bankai, Konjigi Ashisogi Jizo Matai Fukuen Shotai. Now be sure to stick around until the very end of this video as I'll be covering two very brief anime original scenes that we got this week, the first featuring Lil Barrow, and the second one is a conversation between the Sternritters, Bazby, Giselle and Lil Toto. Before beginning the review, I need to clear up that this episode is actually the first of what appears to be a slight restructuring of the battles which occur during this portion of the manga. From a recent interview with the joint series directors Toguchi and Murata, they had explained that they are restructuring the big fights which had happened within this part of the manga story. This is in order to better depict these battles which are actually happening at the same time. So before I do give everything away in the intro of this video, let's begin my review for episode 34 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime titled Baby Hold Your Hand. We got really tired of the same old boring anime shirts, so we decided to launch Getsuga.com with the aim of creating designs inspired by our favorite anime and manga. We came up with designs that look cool and represent all of our favorite stories. Check out the latest Instinct collection, which features some amazing designs like this Frosted Heavens design inspired by Toshiro Hitsugaya, or this Instinct design inspired by Holo Ichigo, and my personal favorite, which is the Heart design, which was inspired by Ukiura Shifa. Do not miss out, go to Getsuga.com and wear your favorite stories. This week's episode juggles around 4.5 chapters worth of manga content, which I could not falter in the slightest as it was all adapted masterfully. There are many scenes which had caught my attention, but one that takes precedence is definitely the episode's opening scene, where we have a brief recap of the events of the finale of episode 33, right after Uryu defeats Renji. Now we do see that Lil Barrow had also been watching Uryu all of this time, and it seems like he was contemplating sniping him as well. I have already discussed about how it feels like Hashward and the Schutzstaffels seem more trusting of Uryu within the anime than they were in the manga, but Cour 3 is now beginning to make me wonder if this is really the case. We know that throughout the entirety of Cour 3, Hashward has been intently watching over Uryu's every move. I mean, to the extent that even while he was trapped within Senjumaru's Bankai, Hashward was still keeping close tabs on Uryu, and not to mention that he had observed all of his battle against Ichigo and then he was watching his fight with Renji. Personally, I think that this is a really great way of depicting the suspicion of the Schutzstaffel. Instead of them overtly dropping hints to Uryu's face, I think the anime is doing a great job of them keeping a cordial front with Uryu while covertly keeping a close eye on him. This adds a higher level of tension to the anime events in comparison to how things had happened within the manga. There is quite a lot to praise about this episode, in particular the banter between Kenpachi and Mayuri, which I was so happy to see finally animated. No matter who is seen to be talking to Kenpachi, you can guarantee that it's going to be an entertaining interaction. I mean, the conversations with him end up having some of the best dialogue in the series. A couple of episodes ago, just when he was freshly healed from the treatment room, his brief discussion with Nanao was a great character defining moment for both of them, and now you have his hijinks with Mayuri prior to the battle against Pernida. Speaking of Mayuri, his voice actor Ryusei Nakao did a fantastic job in this week's episode. Again, this is to be expected with a veteran voice actor like Nakao, who is also known for voicing iconic characters like Frieza from Dragon Ball. While we are on the topic of vocal performances, I cannot go on without mentioning the amazing work of the legend Bin Shimada, who I was really looking forward to hearing voicing Pernida. He really did not disappoint as he lived up to all of my expectations. He is again another character who is known for his work on Dragon Ball, as he is the Japanese voice actor for Broly. If you remember, at the end of the Dragon Ball Super Broly movie, these two characters actually did have a battle where Broly beat the living daylights out of Frieza. So it's great to see both of these voice actors return within Bleach, playing the characters of Mayuri and Pernida respectively. Let's now go over how this episode went about adapting the battles from the manga. Kenpachi vs Pernida was exactly as it had occurred within the manga, and I've seen a lot of fans online hoping that this fight may have been changed with some anime exclusive editions, as they feel that Kenpachi shouldn't have lost to Pernida in the way that he did because it gives him a bad look. If you recall to last week's episode where there was some anime exclusive dialogue between Mayuri and Kenpachi, Mayuri had spoken about how there are two types of battles. The first is a mindless fight which only relies on pure strength and power, while the second is an intellectual battle filled with strategy. This exchange between the two of them before they had encountered Pernida serves to preemptively prepare you for Kenpachi's defeat. Mayuri even says during the battle that Pernida is not the type of opponent who can be defeated by brute force. So I for one am very glad that the anime had decided to remain faithful to the manga by not adding any additional fluff here to Kenpachi. He rushed into the battle without any preparation and he suffered the consequences. Mayuri had to intervene by paralyzing him so that he would not do further damage to himself. Now, when Mayuri's fight against Pernida kicks off, there are a number of things which had caught my eye. The first is the fact that this is probably one of the most faithful battles which has been adapted from the manga. There were no cuts to any content here. It's literally the manga playing out in anime form panel for panel. I mean, think back to certain battles like Renji vs Mask or even Gremi vs Kenpachi. There were notable cuts and streamlining of content for those battles. The manga content spanning from chapter 635 to the first page of 640 is pretty dialogue heavy, and while it does have some action, it doesn't feature a lot of the intense action which takes place during the second half of Mayuri's fight with Pernida. Now, this does leave us with an episode which features a lot of Mayuri yapping, which honestly is really entertaining. Last week in my manga vs anime comparison video, I'd spoken about how Mayuri vs Pernida is actually one of the longest fights from this portion of the 1000-Year Blood War arc. This fight lasts for just under 9 chapters. None of the other battles from this part of the manga are this long. I feel like this is the point where Kubo's health really started to deteriorate, and it was after this fight that things had started to get really rushed. So it's for this reason that not too many additions are needed to expand upon this battle, so I can see why everything is being so faithfully adapted. Now, while I have just said that there was one very brief anime exclusive edition in this episode, and it was right after the mid-card, and it's a brief discussion between Bazz-B, Lil Toto and Giselle. It wasn't anything really major, it was just a brief pep talk amongst peers before they will proceed to get absolutely massacred in the upcoming episodes, but we'll talk about that when that happens. Overall, episode 34 was still a fantastic episode where it had felt like the episode had only lasted for 5 minutes because time had flown by that quickly. I was enjoying it that much. In terms of the animation, I would say it's nowhere near as explosive of a showcase in comparison to the raw animation talent that we saw from episodes like 30 or 33, but it still stands out for a number of reasons. The first is that this episode is the first storyboard credit for the legendary Atsushi Wakabayashi, and I couldn't be more glad that he was given this credit for an episode as iconic as this, the 400th episode of Bleach. In Cour 2, he was the storyboarder and action animation director for episode 18, but in terms of Cour 3, he has only really storyboarded this week's episode, and he's been the action animation director for episode 28. So we've yet to see him in Cour 3 have both of these credits. And while he didn't direct episode 34, it was still greatly benefited from his storyboarding. Honestly, if there is one thing that the Bleach production team has been blessed with since Cour 2, it's the presence of extremely talented storyboarders who have been in the industry for a long time. This episode did feature some talented key animators like Wakabayashi himself, who I'm convinced worked on the dynamic Mayuri chase sequence, and we had returning animators like Hugh Chen, who was also present in episode 28, Yuki Kitajima, a fantastic animator from Gintama, who was also contributing to the action in today's episode, and then you have the work of Tadashi Fukuda, who I'm also sure had a notable impact on the episode, along with so many other talented animators. I love that Bleach now has drawn so much talent, even for episodes with relatively less intense action sequences. Now I think it's time for us to address the elephant in the room, and it's the CGI which was used in this week's episode. I think that this is definitely going to be something you're going to be debating in the comments. It's going to be a deal breaker for a lot of you, and look, I do agree that it did look a bit janky in some scenes, but in other scenes I did find the CGI to look quite good. I believe that if there's any issue with this episode, then it isn't the CGI or the animation, but the disproportionate amount of dialogue in comparison to the action. Despite this, it's still a very solid episode, as I believe that this was a warm-up for the action-heavy second half, where I think that Pierrot Films is not going to be pulling any of the punches. I'm grateful that this isn't the same situation as Gremmy vs Kenpachi, where they had squeezed so many chapters into a single episode. Okay, well there you have it. This was my initial thoughts on Bleach 1000 Year Blood War episode 34. This was yet another solid episode which marks the 400th anime episode of the series, and from the iconic interactions between Mayuri and Kenpachi, then Kenpachi getting sidelined by Mayuri so that his battle against the very strange Pernida can finally begin. This episode retained all of Kubo's quirky humor, which has typically been cut from the anime. Ikkaku, Yumichika and Nemu have their funny commentary which has all been left intact. But yeah, we have reached the point of the video where I want to hand over the discussion to all of you. What are your thoughts about the first half of Mayuri vs Pernida? Did you like how Pernida's true form was depicted with CGI? Did you like seeing Mayuri's modified Bankai? And then not to forget, what do you think about the amazing voice talent from Mayuri and Pernida's voice actors? Next week's episode is titled Don't Chase a Shadow, and this is named after chapter 645. Now this means that the second half of Mayuri vs Pernida has been pushed back, as we are cutting to Shunsui vs Lil Barrow in episode 35. But yeah, for now, be sure to continue the discussion in the comments. Let me know what you loved about this week's installment of Bleach, and lastly, thank you for making it to the end of this video, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow for my complete manga versus anime comparison of this week's episode. A massive thank you goes out to all of my amazing Patreon supporters for helping to make this video possible. If you also want to support the channel and see your name in the end of my videos, then check out my Patreon, which has loads of perks like early video access and so much more. Thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.